So yeah, welcome everybody to this book talk. Today we're super excited to have with us Professor Kimberly Nicholas to talk about her research, her recent book, Under the Sky We Make, How to Be Human in a Warming World. Professor Kimberly Nicholas is a sustainability scientist at Lund University. She is the author of Under the Sky We Make and the monthly climate newsletter, We Can Fix It. Born and raised on her family's vineyard in Sonoma, California, she studied the effect of climate change on the Californian wine industry for her PhD in environment and resources at Stanford University. She has published over 50 articles on climate and sustainability in leading peer-reviewed journals, and her research has been featured in outlets including the BBC, New York Times, the Washington Post, BuzzFeed, and more. In her research, she studies the connections between people, land, and climate with the goal of stewarding ecosystems to support a good life for everyone alive today and leave a thriving planet for future generations. I first came across Kimberly's work when actually one of her studies on what kind of choices an individual can make to reduce her impact on climate. And that study gained quite a lot of interest on international media. And then I came again across Kimberly's work when I was looking into travel policy for the institute that I was working for. And it turns out that the travel policy of Lund University, where Professor Kimberly is based and Professor Kimberly contributed to, has a very good travel policy, which is both quite ambitious and actionable. So Kimberly, on your recent book, why did you write this book?
Thank you, Georgia, for having me here, for convening this lovely group, and for your very kind introduction. I wrote this book to try and make climate change personal and urgent and actionable for people like myself and my friends from college. Really, I was thinking of friends who I've had for a long time who are informed, who know that climate change is happening, humans are causing it, it's bad, but actually then get a bit stuck about what they can do about it and how it can really, climate action can really fit into their lives. So I wanted to give people a handbook for combining facts, feelings, and action to face climate change.
Great. And how was your thinking on environmental justice and intersectionality, something we often discuss at Wiser? How did it evolve over time?
Well, definitely still evolving, I would say, and something I'm actively trying to listen to diverse voices and learn more about myself. But I guess where I'm at right now is I feel that my contribution to environmental and climate justice is primarily focused at the moment on getting the climate privilege, which includes people like myself, to recognize our privilege and to use it in constructive rather than harmful ways, and to thereby create more space for everybody. So we know from research that it's only about 10% of people globally that cause almost half of climate pollution from households, and that's a major source of emissions worldwide. So if we're going to meet the Paris Agreement, we're going to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees, keep 1.5 alive, we're the group that has to change first and fastest. So I think, and that's very clear in demands for equity in the international negotiations, like just concluded in Glasgow and COP26. And for a long time from the least developed nations and those who have done the least, the most vulnerable, who have done the least to cause climate change and are suffering the most impacts, there's a very clear demand that high emitters reduce our emissions. And we need to take that demand seriously at the national level for countries, at the business level for companies, and at the individual level for high emitters.
Yeah, my next question is quite relevant to the answer that you've gave me already, but is focusing on what is really climate privilege, why does it matter, and how does fighting climate change look quite different between different groups, people that have more or less financial resources?
So I define climate privilege as being in the group that has historically benefited the most from fossil fuel emissions, which is burning fossil fuels is the main cause of climate change. It's about 87% of CO2 pollution, and that's the biggest greenhouse gas, and that carbon pollution lasts essentially forever. So some of the carbon we release today will last for more than 10,000 years. And when you consider that Stonehenge or the Great Pyramids in Egypt are around plus minus 5,000 years, not even around half that old, you realize, this legacy of climate pollution and carbon in the atmosphere is just the most important mark that we could possibly leave. And right now, our climate legacy is certainly not one to be proud of. So in terms of climate privilege, I'm trying to acknowledge past harm from burning fossil fuels and then get to the root source of that harm, which is to leave fossil fuels in the ground and to have a fair and fast, just transition to not burning fossil fuels, and recognize that, again, it's everyone needs to act within the sphere where they have agency and power, and that doesn't let others off the hook. For example, politicians and business leaders and oil companies definitely have enormous responsibility, but even ordinary people sprinkled throughout society have so much more power than we currently realize or use.
Yeah, we're going to get back to the role of individuals later on. But in your book, you come up with these 5 stages of radical climate acceptance, as you point out, which are ignorance, avoidance, doom, all the feels, and purpose. How would you say that the readers can navigate those different stages, and what would you say to people who are quite stuck in the avoidance or in the doom phases?
Well, I would say you have my empathy because I've also been there and it sucks and it's hard. So you're not alone. I think I created those stages over time and trying to kind of understand both my own experience, my own journey, and what research and um, other findings were telling us this journey looks like. And I guess the first thing I would say is the idea that there is some kind of framework that you can use to potentially recognize, yourself and others. That itself, I hope, it can be a helpful way to relate to this. That, for example, I think it's really important to know that doom is not the end. I think many people are in avoidance of tough climate truths because they fear that doom is just on the other side of really facing facts, and they don't want to live with doom, so they would rather live in avoidance. And so I think an important point there is that doom is not the end, it is a phase. And it's not like these steps go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you're done and you live happily ever after. I mean, there certainly can be repetitions and iterations, but I guess the more you're able to name, sit with, confront, tolerate, even celebrate all the climate feels, which can include grief and anger, but also community and resilience and creativity. That is the path to purpose, and that is how you can figure out what is really important to you, where you want to focus your limited time and energy, and how you can actually be of service in this super important, critical climate work that we need all hands on deck for right now.
Yeah, in your book, you talk about climate and ecological grief. And I think another term quite mainstream, becoming very mainstream nowadays, especially in the younger generation, is eco-anxiety. And I'm wondering, how have you experienced eco-anxiety or climate and ecological grief? And what do you say to your students that I make an assumption here that they come to you with worries about their future?
Yeah, I think this took me, and it's still a process, but this has definitely taken me a really long time to acknowledge and confront. The first time I heard climate grief discussed, it wasn't given that name, but it wasn't until 2016, which is pretty recent. I mean, considering that I was an undergrad on a research project studying climate change in 1996, so a long time ago now. But I feel like the feelings haven't really caught up with us until more recently, or at least for many of us. I mean, some people have been way ahead on this, but I think a lot of it is having personal lived experience of losing something you love or care about, or seeing something you love and care about harmed or diminished. And it's quite natural and normal and healthy that that triggers a feeling of grief. So in the book, I write about losing one of my best friends to cancer and the process of Paul Pubby and his wife Lucy facing cancer as doctors and as wonderful human beings. And I think that actually taught me a lot about not being afraid of grief. So I would distinguish between climate or ecological grief and eco anxiety. Grief is a response to loss that has occurred. So it's something that is ongoing now or has happened in the past. And then I think it is really important to acknowledge and honor and find ways to share and create rituals around and community that supports you in that grief, as you would for the loss of a loved one. Eco anxiety is different because anxiety relates to our relationship with the future. So anxiety is about fear of or concern about or difficulty tolerating the uncertainty of the future. So I do have that, and many of my students do have that, and it is a big topic. I think the best way to navigate it is working with purpose, knowing that you know, of course, never perfectly, but consistently and overall have made conscious choices to try and be of most service and use what I can, in writing and speaking and trying to be of use basically in the things I think are fun, the things I like doing, the things that I'm good at or want to get better at. Those are sort of the sweet spot for where I can be of service. And there was one more thing I wanted to say, but I don't remember. So yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I guess also writing this book is part of exactly trying to, with your own way, contribute to that, and then also overcome feelings of eco-anxiety.
Oh, sorry. Yes, you're absolutely right. And I do remember the other thing. I mean, the other way of coping is all the healthy ways of coping with being a human in general of, exercise, time outside, time with friends and family, prioritizing your well-being, taking breaks, not spending too much time on screens and social media, things, eating healthy, sleeping as well as you can. I mean, stuff that we all know and your mom knows. And I mean, there is research behind it, but like the things that actually keep you healthy and happy are really important practices to cultivate in general for your health and happiness and well-being. I think especially during the pandemic, we all have relearned many parts of that lesson, and especially in living in the age of climate change as we do now, having those practices that center us and refill our energy and keep us, happy and healthy and able to do what we can, those are super important.
Yeah. So we are at Wiser, we're a women's and non-binary network of scientists. And so I wanted to ask you this question of how is it really to be a sustainability scientist in the situation that we're living in today?
It's kind of bizarre because it certainly is not what I thought I was signing up for. I mean, in the 90s when I was an undergrad, I loved hiking and climbing and being in the mountains, and I did that for fun in high school. And then I got to college and found that I could get paid to hike around in the mountains and look at plants. And I thought, this sounds like a dream job. I'm going to do this. I'm going to fly all over the world because this is what all my professors are doing. They're meeting interesting people and doing field work in all these exotic places. That sounds fun. And that's just not at all what it ended up being. I mean, I think I guess several things happened. I realized more and more that it didn't make sense for me to focus on wilderness areas, which was kind of my first original interest because I love being in nature. But increasingly, I mean, humans dominate the planet, both at land and at sea. Increasingly, the atmosphere, I mean, every part of the earth has been touched by humans. And we know at the moment we're really exceeding sustainable levels in many of those planetary boundaries, including climate, but also biodiversity, land use, and others. So basically, I kind of shifted to focus more on the relationship between people and nature. And over time, it's just become more and more clear to me that the main good I can do in the world is not really through publishing another paper, but through getting the word out, and the public does trust and care about and want to hear from scientists, even in this age of polarization and fake news and other discouraging trends. But scientists are very trusted messengers, and I think it's really important that we speak out and speak really clearly for, look, this is what the world has agreed to in the Paris Agreement. It basically means we have to virtually completely stop burning fossil fuels, and we have to do that really quickly. So, pointing out the discrepancies between ongoing policies or media coverage or whatever in the area of your own, domain of expertise, I think is just super important. But definitely it's not what I thought I was signing up for. I was like, oh, I'm going to hike around in the forest and count butterflies. That's not what I do.
Yeah. You mentioned how publishing another paper is not maybe feeling as valuable as maybe as it used to. And then I'm wondering, do you think that the scientific community has done a good job in helping people move from climate despair or the doom or the avoidance phases we talked earlier to action? And what would you say is really the role of sustainability scientists today?
No, I can't say that I think scientists have done a good job in facilitating that transition from despair to action. I think we can have a discussion about, is that really a necessary or valid role for scientists to play? And I have a wide view on that. I mean, I think scientists can be really helpful to that transition, but I think scientists can be helpful in many different ways. I mean, I think we don't have the option to stand on the sidelines and, passively watch all the climate targets blow by and oops, now we've set off all these tipping points because we were too busy trying to publish a paper. Like, that's obviously a terrible outcome. But I certainly don't blame scientists for the fact that we're so far behind in reducing emissions. I mean, I think scientists have tried really hard to get the message out about the impacts of climate change, what it will take to stop it, which is stopping burning fossil fuels and switching to sustainable and regenerative and mostly plant-based agriculture. So that message is out there. I mean, I think scientists could be better and more better at finding the right audiences just to convey that message to. But I don't hold scientists, especially when we know that there's been a very well organized and funded and ongoing misinformation campaign by some of the big companies and oil companies in particular. That's really well documented now by Naomi Oreskes at Harvard, Ben Franta at Stanford, and others. So I can't I think we should look elsewhere for, why are we so far behind? There's been basically political and vested interests that prefer the status quo.
Yeah, actually, the research documenting all the lobbying against climate change it's very heartbreaking to read through, and yes. Often I'm thinking the scientists doing this job, they must have had very hard skin managing to go through all the documents and to digest everything and then write about it. So yeah, last week I was having dinner with a very dear friend, and we had this discussion of different things that as an individual one can do, including not flying and what we eat and so on. But then we got into this discussion of individuals versus policymakers and businesses, and that's something that I'm personally struggling a lot with to kind of come up with a way to think about whether we go for individuals or whether we really try to make change more on a policy or company level and big multinationals. And in your book, you spend a lot of time focused on what individuals can do to decrease their carbon footprint, even though we ultimately require quite massive policy changes to get to zero emissions. And in your last chapter, you really talk about how to, you mentioned that individuals have much more power to make meaningful change than most of us actually realize. So in what ways would you say that's true?
Great question. So the way I'm thinking about this has been quite shaped actually by a recent paper that I published with colleagues, even though I said we don't need another paper. I mean, I love writing papers and I think it's so fun to discuss ideas with friends and colleagues and develop them and mentor early career researchers in doing research. So I certainly don't mean to speak badly about research. It's just that I feel like there's this balance between, as academics, basically all of our incentives and rewards and career milestones and so on are centered around that, around producing and funding new research. Whereas I feel that there's urgency to do outreach and benefit society with that research as well. But anyway, so this, I think of 5 roles where individuals can play a really important and meaningful role. And basically, I think of these 5 as the bridge between individual and collective action. This is how individuals can effect meaningful system change. And that's who I'm writing for and to. So, I mean, if CEOs want, or presidents of countries want my advice on what they should do, I'm very happy to tell them. But for the rest of us, I mean, we need meaningful action. So those 5 roles are, as you mentioned, your own consumption, reducing our own overconsumption. Secondly, how we behave as investors. Third, how we behave as role models. Fourth, our impact as part of organizations like work or school, leisure organizations. And fifth, as citizens. And basically, I really want people to pick one and start doing it. So if people are like, oh, I don't think my own personal carbon footprint is important, you're actually wrong if you're a high emitter, and especially if you're a scientist. There's really clear research showing that a large amount of carbon comes from personal choices of high emitters, that scientists are viewed as more credible if we practice what we preach. If we, for example, don't fly or fly less, that has a really big impact on our credibility and affects the public's willingness to take our advice on behavior change and policy change. But even if you're like, oh, I don't want to start there, for whatever reason, great. Then what are you doing as a citizen? How are you actually working to change policy? What are you doing within your own organization? As you mentioned, for example, your flying less policy within Chalmers. How are you engaging there? So, I mean, I think it's not, I don't want to pit these actions against each other. I think they are really all necessary. They can be mutually reinforcing, and basically starting on any is and engaging on any. My goal actually in a new project is to get people to take 2 hours per week of meaningful high impact climate action. So that would be 20 minutes per day. You can take Sundays off because we need to rest. That's the climate action too. Naps are actually very good for both well-being and climate. So that's like a good, that can be your action on Sundays.
Win-win.
Yes. But, I was looking at time use studies, and at least in the US, people spend 10 hours a day consuming media from screens. So they spend like 3.5 hours a day watching TV, and I mean, hours on social media and hours. And so it's like, I think most of us can spare 20 minutes. So how do we use those 20 minutes a day or a couple hours a week to actually effectively engage in one of those high impact actions? And that I think would be really transformative if we get people engaging.
Mhm. Is that something that you're implementing in your personal life?
Yes. I mean, I think I am over that budget already.
Yeah, I'm wondering, how have you personally made some of the changes you write about in the book, and yeah, what has the experience been like when trying to make changes in your lifestyle?
So my personal footprint choices, the biggest thing I've done is gone from being a frequent flyer. So in 2010, I took 15 round trip flights. So that puts me definitely in this group of 1% of the global population who emits half the climate pollution from flying. So many of us, especially in academia, might not really realize or think about it, but flying is actually a very elite and privileged activity. Most people on Earth have never been on a plane. Most people, even in the US, Germany, the UK, didn't fly in the average year, even pre-pandemic. Of course, the situation's been different in the last couple of years. But I think as I said, part of what made me want to be a scientist initially was like, oh, travel and, new places and adventure, and professors who I had who were flying all the time. So that was the hardest change to make, but that was by far what reduced my emissions the most. And that was inspired by my friend Charlie Wilson, who's from the Tyndall Centre, now at Oxford in the UK, who had stopped flying within Europe. And we went to a climate conference together. We had a very long day of very depressing PowerPoints about how bad everything already was and was going to get worse. And then I just kind of looked around and thought, wait a minute, I flew here. Most of these people flew here. We are the best informed audience in the world, basically, and all of us believe the data. Like, we know that this is happening, but it's like we're a room full of doctors telling our patients to quit smoking cigarettes, and we're puffing on cigarettes ourselves. So I just couldn't handle the cognitive dissonance anymore, and it was really helpful to have an inspiration and a role model. I mean, back to that role model role, who had done it, who had tips to share, who could answer my questions, who was encouraging and non-judgmental. And so that was the biggest. I think stopping eating meat was, I was for a long time what I called a Paris vegetarian, which like isn't even a thing, and I don't even know what it means. It's like, oh, I don't have meat unless I'm in Paris. But then the definition of Paris like quite expanded. So I ended up inspired by another friend, joining a vegan challenge for a month, so not eating any animal products. And then after that month realized, oh, there's a lot actually I don't miss and could live without. I do want to have some eggs and cheese, but most of the other stuff I can actually skip, or I found substitutes that I liked better. So I guess the bottom line is I found it easier and more fun to make these changes than I imagined before. And I think an important insight from psychology is that people are very loss averse. So when we imagine the future, it's very easy to think about, here's what I have now and I get these benefits from it and I don't want to lose it. We're not that good at thinking about all the positive things that can come from change, especially when you choose a change that's in line with your values. So I think that's been like a wonderful surprise, and definitely in my case led to romance. On my fourth date with my husband, Simon, we went to Paris by train. And I thought, like, this will never work. This 15 hours with like someone I really don't know that well. We're not going to like each other anymore at the end of it, but it'll just be efficient and like rule him out. But actually it was, it's a good relationship crucible. If you like someone after 15 hours on a train, even more, and had a great time, it's a good sign.
Yeah, one actually of the aspects of really enjoying reading the book, which is quite, I mean, for somebody who maybe is not hasn't read that much about climate change, can be quite hard to read and kind of digest the facts. But one of the things that you do in the book that makes it very engaging and easy to follow is that you share a lot of your personal experience, which makes it very engaging, as I said. But in the book, you argue that one key to stabilizing the climate will be a change in mindset. So a shift away from what you use as a term, exploitation mindset. What is that exploitation mindset, and what has that meant for you personally?
Yeah, that actually, I'm back at work now for the first time in a long time, and I came up with that idea on this whiteboard over here. So it's kind of fun to be back in this room with a colleague and office mate, basically, so a friend from down the hall. Who we were discussing this, and I basically wanted to capture some principles that people could apply in their own life, because of course I do draw from my experience, and I'm only one person, and I mean the data are universally applicable, but your mileage may vary in terms of how to apply these principles. So I wanted to point out basically what I see as the root cause of a lot of our problems, climate and otherwise, are these two fundamentally flawed assumptions. And they're not universal truths, but they're baked into a lot of our society in ways that I wanted to highlight and shine a light on and start to unravel a bit and suggest something better. So the exploitation mindset is based on these two faulty ideas: the idea that some people are more worthy or superior to other people, and the idea that people in general are superior to nature. And what I propose instead is what I call the regeneration mindset, which would first recognize the rights and protect and care for people and nature, both, Secondly, get to the root cause of harm rather than trying to treat its symptoms. And third, increase resilience. So that's connections and diversity and the ability to thrive and cope with change, both for individuals, for us in community collectively, and for natural ecosystems, because we all really need that power.
And what are your thoughts on making the climate movement more accessible and make people more aware?
I think we really have to reach beyond the bubble. So I feel like there's such a big gap between people who already, I mean, most people are already concerned or alarmed about climate change. That's what the research tells us. So they don't actually need a lot more facts in terms of, hey, it's warming. I mean, here's my protest sign from 2014 with my students, it's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, we can fix it. That's a framework I've used for a long time now to teach about climate change and put on this now quite beaten up and old footnoted protest sign. So it's not facts that we're lacking to engage people. That concern is already there. But I think it's linking that concern with things that we already care about and spend time on in a way that is actionable. That's what research shows gives people energy and agency. So I mean, maybe that's sports. There's just Seth Wines just published last week a paper on the climate impact of Major League Sports in the US and how the pandemic actually caused people to schedule more sensibly. So emissions went down quite a lot by just having a different travel schedule where sorry, where teams weren't flying, there and back and there and back all the time, but would go somewhere, play several games regionally, then return. So maybe it's arts, maybe it's music, maybe it's dance, maybe it's, I mean, whatever your interests are already, I feel like that's the place to start with and engage with climate and figure out how you can be useful to stopping climate change in that sphere that you already are. So I think it's, feels like too big of a barrier for people to be like, oh, I do these things and I have this life and these priorities. And suddenly I'm supposed to drop everything and, become a climate activist and stand on the streets. And that's not me. So then I guess I can't do anything. And that's totally wrong. I mean, that's why I want to have this smorgasbord of these 5 roles and then many high impact actions within each of them, where whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever you care about, it's really dependent on climate change. I mean, stopping climate change to stay good. So there's where you can start with your meaningful actions.
Yeah, so let's maybe all start to being more creative and engaging within our circles. You talked about activism just now, and we can see your poster from a climate march. You often say that personal is political, and I'm wondering in what ways would you say that activism works?
We know from research that it works. We know that, the way to change hearts and minds on a large scale is through social movements. And on a personal scale, it can be engaging in one-to-one conversations. And that's more of that role model and sort of inspiring by example role. But to essentially move the Overton window, this idea of what is politically possible and acceptable, that's subject to change. I mean, what sets that is what makes headlines, what people talk about, online and at the water cooler when wherever at work in person and with our friends and in social contexts. And that is a human construct, basically. So what the possibility of really solving climate change well, which, if we do that, then we need to cut emissions in half in the next 100 months, which is a really big job globally. That really depends on what we talk about and think is possible, and then thereby make possible. So, I mean, talking is certainly not enough, but if we don't talk about it, we're definitely not going to get there. I mean, it has to be like part of everyday conversation. So I think we know from research that what what works politically is voting, being part of political or charity organizations, so climate groups, or the climate chapter of whatever group you're already a part of that might not have a climate focus itself, getting media attention, whether that's writing an op-ed or being on social media and amplifying others' voices. Those are really high impact climate actions. So we know that those make a difference to changing policy by affecting politicians.
Mhm. Yeah. So I'm going to move on to my last questions, and then I would invite everybody that you can start writing your questions in the comments, or you can raise your hand, and then we can have a discussion. So my last question before going to the Q&A session is going back to feelings that I think we touched upon earlier, but in your book, you write a lot about feelings and how important they are, and that we need to confront some feelings, and the fact that some of our world would basically not survive and go through grief, potentially anger, and so on. Why is this so important?
I think it's important for two reasons. One, because it's true, and two, because it works. So I would say, I mean, first, even if it didn't do us any good to feel all the climate feels in terms of like practical outcomes, we just have to do that as human beings to be healthy and be able to cope with life. I mean, I think that was like a very hard lesson for me to learn, where until my early 30s, when I got divorced, which is not a coincidence, I would say, I was trying to make all decisions like with pro con lists and Excel spreadsheets and some kind of decision analysis that had some, weighted outcome utilities and blah, blah, blah. And that's all well and good. And it's great to have those tools. But we also, I mean, we just have to sit with and handle and tolerate and make the best of, and ideally, make friends with, or at least recognize and acknowledge our feelings, because otherwise they just totally hamper us from achieving our potential and doing what we want to do. And I think, that was like a big realization for me. And then, and that's more the domain of psychology. But there's lots of research on that. I can recommend there Gen Dread by Britt Ray. It's a really great newsletter where she's a climate psychologist, basically writing about some of the underlying research behind all the climate emotions. And then secondly, because feelings are really powerful and they can help motivate us. They sustain our interest and energy. I mean, we need our rational mind and planning and facts and science to basically focus our energy in the right direction and, tell us what is high and low impact and where it is effective to work. But then our feelings are what really get us out of bed in the morning and keep us motivated and help us create community, which is a huge part of making this work fun and joyful and rewarding and something we want to be a part of. So yeah, I think both, because that's just like how to be human in a warming world. It's like you got to feel your feelings for better or worse, sorry. And two, because it does really help us be effective agents of change, positive change, to stop climate change.
Mm-hmm. Great. So we'll move on to the Q&A. I already have 2 questions in the chat, so I'll start reading those. So Julie is asking, after the recent COP in Glasgow, are you more or less optimistic about our ability to use our 5 roles to get us collectively where we need to go? Are the COPs even relevant?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, what on my mind and many other people right now. I mean, I think the international climate process is still important and relevant. That is how the world has collectively decided to handle the problem of climate change, is on the national level, and it's states, countries who are the parties to the Paris Agreement. And that's what sets our collective agenda as humanity, to say, okay, we've agreed we're going to stop climate change. To do that, we will entirely stop adding carbon to the atmosphere. that almost all has to come from stopping burning fossil fuels at the source. Maybe there's some room for carbon removals, but we shouldn't count on it because we know we have to stop burning fossil fuels. So I think having those kind of frameworks in place is very important. But for a big reason it's important is for people back home to hold leaders to account in meeting those targets, or those promises, which one country in the world right now, the Gambia, is doing. So that the Gambia has climate policy that is in line with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. No other country has that. And the Gambia is a small country who's hardly emitted anything. So, I mean, I applaud their leadership, but it's certainly not on their shoulders to fix this whole problem. And we obviously need the big emitters like the US and Europe, who've caused half of climate pollution, and Canada is in that group too, to step up. So I think I actually didn't get that wrapped up in the COP. I mean, I've had a chance to go to two of them. I was in Paris in 2015 and in Bonn in 2017. And I mean, it feels very exciting and important when you're there. So I think that work is important. It does matter, but it doesn't start or end at the COPs. I mean, what matters is what people do on the ground. And we need, on the one hand, it would be amazing if we had really strong leadership and that set the direction and people all said, okay, great, we have this clear signal from world leaders, now we're going to follow. But it doesn't look like it's really turning out that way. And that means that the pressure has to come from below to hold leaders accountable and to show through our actions, through our support for policies, look, we actually want fast and fair and ambitious and effective climate policy and changes that will actually work. So we're standing behind it. So I guess, I mean, I'm doing more work on the city level and a little more decentralized level. And I think that's more where we're seeing more climate leadership than in many cases at the national level.
Yes, and I have a couple of questions that came up in my mind while you were talking, but I'll first go with a question from Nilakshi. Thank you for a very engaging book discussion. In your work on the possibilities of individual action, would you say that there are some limitations to what individuals can do? If so, could you point out some?
Sure. Thanks, Nilakshi. Great question. Well, the answer the first popped to my mind is a little bit saucy. Maybe this isn't what you are asking, but what came to my mind is, yes, individuals can't do the things they never try. I mean, like and I think that is actually one of our biggest limitations at the moment. So 2/3 of people almost never think or talk or act on climate change. It's 6% who have donated in the last year to an environmental or climate organization. And it's 1% who have volunteered their time for such an organization. So I think individuals cannot do what they don't even attempt to do. And that's like a very obvious statement, but I think it's really important to understand what an incredibly low baseline we're starting from of people just not doing anything. And if people did start focusing on these 5 roles, these high impact climate actions throughout their daily lives, it would make a huge difference. But that said, I think your question, I imagine, was more directed as, can individuals single-handedly solve the climate crisis? No, they can't. I mean, we need policies and infrastructure and large-scale systems to change. And it's not only individuals who can make that change happen. They have a very important role in those systems. But yes, we obviously also need governments to play the role that only they can, which is to set boundaries on what is allowed and not, to set the rules of the game and the incentives so that it's not cheaper and easier to burn fossil fuels than to do something that doesn't destroy the climate. And eventually, soon, it's no longer should be possible to burn fossil fuels. So government definitely has to play that role. Business has to take their responsibility for completely becoming fossil free as fast as possible. So those decisions happen on an institutional or organizational or political level. But I guess most people, especially most academics, really don't think about the world in those terms. There was an interesting study in Finland. It was a small study of a couple hundred teachers, so it's not super, I can't claim that it's representative for every situation, but it was a really interesting question that they asked. So I thought I've been thinking about it a lot, which is, who bears responsibility for fixing climate change? And the options were individuals, governments, and businesses. And you could also choose some interaction of those three. And, my view is that it is all three are really necessary and no one is sufficient. But actually, most people put a lot of the burden on government and very little on business, but then also have kind of no idea, well, how can I affect businesses or government? And I think it's a big problem if we as individuals, members of society, think it's somebody else's job to fix it and I'm just going to leave it alone. It's definitely not going to get fixed in that case.
Yeah, interesting. I think one of the things that George Monbiot, activist and journalist, is often mentioning is how, which to me is very hopeful, is that if we manage to get 25% of the population engaged, then that's enough to kind of roll out a change. And I think you mentioned this same percentage in your book. Do you want to talk about this 25%? And yeah, I'm wondering how is this how is this measured? How do we know that? And yeah, what are your thoughts around it?
Sure. Yes, I love that study. So one of the main findings there is from a science paper, I think it was 2018, Penn University researchers, through a number of different experiments, found that result pretty consistently, that if you had a dedicated group that was pushing for a norm change, that 25% was actually enough to flip the default state. And I find that really hopeful because, when the world is complicated and it's polarized, and when we look at, COVID numbers, for example, and see, well, 80% of people have followed public health advice and gotten vaccinated, but 20% have not. And, they're having this disproportionate impact on the evolution of the pandemic, for example. That's just super discouraging to me and many people that I know. But it's almost the reverse with climate, that you can have this even still rather small minority of 25% that can be a force for good and actually flip the, from this very bad direction that we're heading in right now for catastrophic climate change with existing policies, and actually make the changes happen in time that we need. So I think, whereas in elections, obviously you need 50% if you have a majority rules party or first past the post or whatever, you need a larger number than that. But it's easier to imagine, okay, I'm not trying to convince, already the majority, something like 60% in the US is concerned or alarmed about climate change. The latest survey was, it was like 72%, I think, who were worried about climate change. You just need to get 1 out of 3 of them to start doing some stuff. And you can really make things happen very fast.
Yeah, that's really quite encouraging. So let's maybe close this session with one last question, which is, we've talked a lot about different aspects of the book, but if you were to answer the question of what do you hope that readers will take away from this book, I think that's a good question to close this session with.
Well, I'm going to turn it around and say you are an ideal reader, Georgia, because you have posted that you and your partner had made a list of what you could do about climate change, from inspired by, initially, you said, reading this book. So that's like my dream outcome, but I don't think everyone has done that yet from reading this book. So I'm still thinking about and working on how do I make that even more tangible. There's like the TLDR, the too long didn't read at the end, that kind of breaks down that, like, here's what I want you to do. Here's what the research said is effective, focus on this. But I think a lot of people still need actually more help and more guidance in how to actually apply it in their daily lives. But I guess what I hope for is that people come away feeling inspired and empowered, and like what they do really matters, because I genuinely believe that. The research shows that we're just alive at this incredibly critical time that is the most important time to ever be a human. And we have so much power and responsibility. And so I want people to realize that and not feel overwhelmed by it, but see a pathway in their daily lives that they have now of how they can make some changes, either things to stop doing, things to start doing, things to shift in a better direction what you're already doing, that feel like, oh yeah, I could do that. That's something I could try.
Perfect. I am really hoping that more and more people will get to read that book. I think it can be a life-changing experience for some, and for others it can be a very empowering experience. So thanks a lot for all the effort put into writing this book that is very accessible, written in a very clear and accessible language. And thanks so much, Kimberly, for being with us tonight and talking about the book.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for joining. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, it was really wonderful. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks, Julie. Bye.
Everyone, bye.